The morning it started, I was carrying a paper cup of coffee back from the break room when I heard my father-in-law speaking in the conference room. The door was partly open. I was still a few steps away when he said, in that polished voice he used for investors and junior staff, innovation needs younger energy. A few people laughed softly. I kept walking. I had heard versions of that line before. I had heard them at company dinners, at holiday parties, and once at my own wedding reception, when he thanked his son for marrying someone practical and thanked me for keeping things simple. That was the language he used when he wanted to reduce a person without looking rude while doing it. At the time, I was 36. I worked for his company in Minneapolis. Officially, I was operations director. In practice, I handled whatever other people dropped. Vendor issues, fulfillment delays, contract renewals, client complaints, forecast corrections. Quiet emergencies that appeared at 6:10 p.m. and somehow still needed to be solved before morning. I had been there a little over 3 years. By then, I knew the sound of the building better than I knew my own apartment. The hum of the old lights over the south hallway, the uneven click in the copier by finance, the dry air in winter that made the carpet hold static until every metal doorknob felt personal. I set my coffee down at my desk and opened the vendor dashboard. Someone had flagged a shipping discrepancy overnight. 2 suppliers were showing different delivery windows for the same parts. It was the kind of thing that could turn into a week of blame if I did not catch it early. I fixed it in 12 minutes, sent 3 emails, updated the timeline, and moved on. That was most of my work. Quiet corrections, preventing fires before anyone else smelled smoke. And still, somehow, I was treated like an extra pair of hands that happened to sit near leadership. Not family, exactly. Not staff, exactly. Something in between. My husband worked in the company too, though in a different department. He was decent, mostly gentle, and much too used to the weather of his father's moods. He still believed things would improve if people just kept being reasonable long enough. I had stopped believing that after my 2nd year. The first year, I thought hard work would settle everything. The 2nd year, I realized hard work only makes some people more comfortable overlooking you. By the 3rd, I had changed how I worked. I still handled problems. I still answered late messages. I still kept impossible clients from leaving. But I also began keeping copies. Not because I was planning anything dramatic. Because I was learning. I saved renewal notes, approval chains, supplier amendments, meeting summaries. I kept email threads in folders with clear names. I made private notes after calls. Dates, times, exact language, who promised what, who delayed what, who took credit for what. Nothing emotional, just records. At first, I told myself it was good management. Then I stopped pretending. I knew what it really was. I had seen too many polished young men appear with expensive shoes and big job titles, only to be handed work someone else had already built. That company liked presentation. It liked last names. It liked confidence delivered in a deep voice across a conference table. It did not especially like competence when it came from the wrong person. A little before noon, my husband texted me. Dad had lunch with an old client and his friend's son. Might bring him in for a quarter. Just an internship. I looked at the message for a moment. Then I put the phone face down. That evening at home, he brought it up again while I was standing at the kitchen counter heating soup. Our condo overlooked a gray stretch of river, and the windows were fogged from the cold. The dishwasher was running. One cabinet door still would not close properly. Small, ordinary things. He's probably just trying to mentor someone, my husband said. I nodded and stirred the soup. He said the guy seemed sharp. Good for him, I said. My husband looked at me carefully then, like he could hear the space between the words. You think this is about you? No, I said. I think I know the pattern. He leaned against the counter, quiet for a moment. He told me you've basically built the foundation for the expansion project. That got my attention, though I did not show much of it. There had been talk for months about a major logistics expansion. Bigger clients. Faster turnaround. New vendor architecture. A system I had already started mapping out in spare pieces of time between other people's mistakes. I lifted my bowl and carried it to the table. He said that. I asked. My husband nodded. He did. I sat down, spoon in hand, and looked past him toward the dark window. It should have felt good. Instead, I felt that old caution settle in again. Not fear, just recognition. Because praise in that company often arrived right before someone else was introduced. The next Monday, the new intern started. His name was Evan. He was 23, freshly out of school, well-dressed in a way that suggested someone else had explained office clothes to him, and he was given a full personal welcome by my father-in-law before lunch. I watched them cross the floor together from my desk. My father-in-law was smiling. That was when I opened one of my contract folders and read a clause I had added myself the previous fiscal year. I read it once, then again. And after that, I closed the file, took one slow sip of coffee, and started making a list. Step 1. Confirm what was in writing. Step 2. Stop explaining myself to people who already benefited from not hearing me. Step 3. Wait. Then I waited. Evan's first week was quiet in the way early weeks usually are. People showed him where the coffee machine was, where the printer jammed most often, and which conference rooms had the reliable Wi-Fi. I watched most of it from my desk without saying much. From where I sat, I could see the front half of the operations floor and the hallway that led toward the executive offices. Morning light usually came through the tall windows behind the finance department and slid slowly across the carpet until it reached our desks around 10. By noon, the place smelled faintly of reheated lunches and printer toner. Routine things. Evan's desk was placed 2 rows down from mine. That surprised me slightly. New interns usually rotated through departments, but this desk came with 2 monitors, a docking station, and a window view of the parking lot. It looked permanent. On the 3rd day, he walked over with a small notebook in his hand. "Hi, sorry," he said politely. "Do you know how to access the vendor management drive?" His voice was careful, the way people sound when they are trying to look capable but know they are still guessing. "I can ask IT to add you," I said. "Thanks." He hesitated, then flipped open the notebook. Mr. Carter mentioned something about reviewing supplier agreements, especially one called North Axis. I nodded once. "That one matters," I said calmly. "Take your time reading it." He wrote something down. Then he returned to his desk. From where I sat, I could see a small yellow sticky note on his monitor later that afternoon. It said, "Call North Axis contact." I watched it for a few seconds and then returned to my screen. The North Axis contract was not complicated exactly, but it was precise. Their operations team preferred dealing with one person instead of 5 departments sending mixed instructions. So during negotiations the year before, I had insisted on a single liaison structure. One name. One thread of communication. Cleaner for everyone. At the time, our legal department asked if that level of specificity was necessary. I had said yes. They added it. Those details matter later, though at that moment they just existed quietly inside a contract database. 2 weeks passed. Evan began appearing in meetings. Not all of them. Mostly the ones that involved the new expansion project. When he spoke, he tended to repeat phrases my father-in-law liked to use. Fresh perspective. Strategic alignment. Streamlined logistics. None of it bothered me at first. People borrow language when they are learning. What I noticed instead was who was no longer speaking. My calendar invitations changed. Some meetings I used to lead were now marked optional, Melissa. That was my name in this version of the story. People used it often enough, though not always in the room where decisions happened. One afternoon, I stopped by the small cafe across the street for iced coffee. The place smelled like roasted beans and citrus cleaner. Through the window, I could see our office building and the long row of parked cars along the curb. That was when I saw my father-in-law sitting outside at a table. Across from him sat Mitch, one of his longtime golf partners. Next to Mitch was Evan. They were laughing about something while my father-in-law gestured with both hands the way he did when he explained ideas he believed were impressive. I could not hear the conversation, but I knew the shape of it. Plans were being drawn somewhere I had not been invited. I finished my coffee and walked back to the office. That evening, around 6:30, a company-wide email arrived. Subject line, exciting expansion ahead. The message was long and carefully vague. Words like synergy, growth phase, and strategic opportunity appeared several times. There were no names attached to leadership yet, only hints about a new project that would reshape the company's logistics structure. My team stopped by my desk before leaving for the night. "This is your project," one of them said, smiling. "You've been building the groundwork for months." I smiled back politely. "Let's see what they decide," I said. But inside, I already understood something important. In that company, groundwork did not always determine ownership. 2 days later, a meeting invite appeared on everyone's calendar. All hands briefing, project elevation. It was scheduled for Friday morning in the large conference room. The same room where I had heard my father-in-law talking about younger energy. Friday arrived cold and gray. The hallway lights buzzed slightly overhead as people filed into the conference room. Someone had arranged trays of pastries and fruit on the side table. That detail caught my attention. Pastries meant one of two things in our office: celebration or damage control. I took my usual seat halfway down the table, not too close to the front, not too far back. A few minutes later, the door opened again. My father-in-law walked in, and Evan walked in right behind him, carrying a laptop. Something about that quiet entrance told me everything I needed to know before the meeting even started. I folded my hands on the table and waited. Then the first slide appeared on the screen, and the room went very quiet. The slide said Project Elevation in a blue font that was trying very hard to look modern. Underneath, it was a subtitle about growth, client capacity, and operational innovation. The language was polished enough, but I knew the material. I had written most of the bones of it in planning drafts over the previous 6 months. My father-in-law stood at the front of the room with his hands loosely folded, smiling as if he were about to hand out scholarships. "We've reached a turning point," he said. "The company needs fresh leadership on this initiative. New energy, new thinking." No one moved. Some people looked at the screen. Some looked down at their notebooks. A few shifted in their chairs the way people do when they already sense a mistake, but do not yet know how public it will become. Then he turned slightly and said, "I'm pleased to announce that Evan will be serving as interim strategic lead for Project Elevation." There was a pause. Not a dramatic one. Just that uncomfortable, suspended silence that happens when a room full of adults hears something plainly wrong and decides, all at once, not to be the first person to say it. Evan stood beside him with one hand on the laptop. He smiled quickly, nodded once, said, "Really grateful for the opportunity." I looked at him. Then I looked at the deck. Then I folded my hands again. I did not argue. I did not ask a question. I did not help anyone save the moment. Around the table, a few people began clapping. Lightly, obligingly, the kind of applause people give when they are waiting for context that never comes. My father-in-law did not look at me once. That part stayed with me longer than the announcement itself. Not the decision, the omission, not even a courtesy sentence. Not even, "Melissa has done important groundwork here." Nothing. By the time the meeting ended, I had already stopped expecting fairness. What I wanted now was clarity. I walked back to my desk, opened my inbox, and answered 2 ordinary emails before doing anything else. One vendor needed a revised delivery estimate. One client wanted confirmation on a dashboard milestone. I handled both. Then I took out a new legal pad and wrote 3 lines at the top. What exists, what depends on me, what must be documented before I leave. That was the moment things changed for me. Quietly. Completely. Not emotionally. Structurally. For the next 4 days, I said very little unless something required an answer. I completed my work. I updated timelines. I left clean notes in the shared systems. I also began reviewing everything tied to the expansion project and every agreement connected to vendor control, implementation penalties, and intellectual property language. Facts first. Always facts first. North Axis was the first file I reopened. The contract confirmed exactly what I remembered. The company had agreed to a named liaison model for all vendor communications through the final quarter, with transfer permitted only after written notice and legal acknowledgement from both sides. Fulcrum Dynamics was next. Different issue there. Their pricing protections and rollout fee waivers were tied to my direct supervision during implementation. That had seemed like a formality at the time. In practice, it meant the cost structure changed the moment I was removed without a formal transition. Then there was the internal architecture draft. That file mattered more than anyone in leadership seemed to understand. Over months, I had built the actual working framework behind the proposed expansion. Vendor sequencing, escalation logic, exception routing, client migration order, fallback timing. It was not glamorous work. Mostly spreadsheets, process maps, and notes that only looked ordinary if you did not understand what they controlled. But I did. And because I did, I also knew exactly where the ownership language lived. Late Thursday afternoon, Evan appeared beside my desk holding a printed agreement. He looked tired. His collar was slightly loose, and the confidence he had worn during the meeting had started to separate around the edges. "Sorry," he said. "Do you have a minute?" I looked up. He held out the pages. "I'm reviewing the North Axis renewal, and I'm not fully following the liaison section. I think I'm missing an earlier draft." I let my eyes rest on the paper for a second. Then I looked back at him. "That file should be in legal's archive," I said. He shifted his weight. "Right." I checked, but I wondered if maybe you had notes. I kept my voice even. "I probably do." He waited. I did not fill the silence for him. After a few seconds, he asked, "Could you send them over?" And that was the first time I felt the shape of the answer settle completely in my mind. Not because I wanted to be difficult, because I had finally understood the rules. For 3 years, I had worked as if being indispensable would eventually make me visible. It does not. It only makes people more comfortable using you without acknowledgement. So I gave myself a different set of rules. Step 1. Finish reviewing every contract tied to my name. Step 2. Do not explain risk to people who chose image over confidence. Step 3. Leave a clean record. I looked at Evan and gave him the same polite expression I had used in hundreds of meetings. "I'll see what can be transferred appropriately," I said. Then I turned back to my screen. He stood there for a moment longer, then nodded and walked away. At 5:42 that evening, after most of the floor had emptied out and the cleaning crew had started down the far hallway, I opened a blank document on my computer. At the top, I typed one line, "Notice of resignation." Then I waited. I did not submit the resignation that night. I drafted it, saved it, and read it twice. The office was nearly empty by then. The overhead lights had gone dim in the outer rows, and the windows reflected more of the room than the city beyond them. My desk lamp cast a small yellow circle over the keyboard. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear the vacuum moving slowly over the carpet. I closed the document and opened my contract folders again. If I was going to leave, I wanted the sequence clean. Not emotional, not reactive, just correct. That weekend, I worked from home at the dining table near the window. It was early November, and the trees along our block had already gone bare. The radiator clicked now and then. I kept tea beside my laptop and moved through the files one by one. North Axis, Fulcrum Dynamics, Hexbridge Industrial, Internal Implementation Maps, Approval Emails, Version Histories. The more I reviewed, the calmer I became. Not because the situation was improving. It was not, but because clarity has its own steadiness. Once the pattern is fully visible, you stop wasting energy hoping it is something else. By Sunday afternoon, I had a legal pad filled with dates, clauses, and next actions. I rewrote the list more neatly. Step 1. Confirm what was contractually assigned to me by name. Step 2. Separate personal knowledge from company property. Step 3. Prepare a lawful exit with written notice and clean handoff boundaries. Step 4. Notify outside parties where the agreements required notification. Step 5. Say less. That last rule mattered more than the others. People often think power means talking at the right moment. Sometimes it means removing extra language so the paperwork can speak without interference. Monday morning, I printed the resignation letter on plain white paper and placed it in a clean envelope. No speech. No extra paragraph. Just the notice period and effective date. Then I spent the first hour of the day doing ordinary work. I approved 2 shipment corrections. I replied to a client question about onboarding timelines. I updated a dashboard note that someone in finance had entered incorrectly. Then I opened the North Axis agreement and drafted a separate email to their legal contact. Short, formal, professional. It did not accuse anyone of anything. It simply notified them that the named liaison listed in the agreement would be departing and asked them to advise on transfer procedure under the existing clause. I did not send it yet. At 10:15, Evan stopped by my desk again. This time he was trying harder to sound confident. "Morning," he said. "Quick question. For the supplier rollout model, is there a master folder or does each department keep its own version?" "There's a master sequence map," I said. "Great. Where is it?" "In the implementation archive." He smiled, relieved. "Perfect." I looked back at my screen. Legal should help you with access. He waited for more. There was not more. By noon, word had already spread that he was getting up to speed. I heard that phrase twice in the hallway and once near the break room where two managers were talking over paper plates and catered sandwiches. The office smelled like roasted meat and warm bread. Somebody laughed at something near the copier. A normal day on the surface. That was the strange part. Institutions can be closest to failure when everything still looks routine from 10 feet away. A little after 2, my father-in-law emailed me. "Stop by when you have a minute. Want to discuss transition support for elevation." Transition support. I read the line once and then archived the message for later. At 2:40, I sent the notice email to North Axis Legal. At 2:46, I sent a second message to outside counsel regarding 2 agreements with named supervision language that would be affected by my departure. At 2:51, I printed copies for my records. Then I stood up, picked up the envelope, and walked to the executive hallway. My father-in-law's office door was open. He was seated behind his desk, jacket off, reading glasses low on his nose, reviewing a printed deck with colored tabs along the side. The room smelled faintly of leather and coffee gone cold. He looked up and smiled the way people do when they expect cooperation. "Melissa," he said. "Come in." I stepped inside and closed the door softly behind me. He gestured toward the chair, but I stayed standing. "I won't take much time," I said. I placed the envelope on his desk. He glanced at it, then back at me. "What's this?" "My notice." For a moment he did not move. Then he picked it up, opened it, and read the page in silence. His expression changed very slightly. Not dramatically. Just a narrowing around the eyes, a pause at the mouth. The look of someone who has always assumed the structure around him will hold. "This is sudden," he said. "No," I said. "It only looks sudden from your side." He leaned back in his chair. "If this is about the project assignment, I think you're taking one decision too personally." I kept my voice level. "You made a staffing choice. I'm making one too." He tapped the paper once against the desk. "You're valuable here." I let that sit for a moment. Then I said that would have been useful information earlier. The room went quiet. Outside the glass wall, someone passed by carrying a folder. I could hear the muted ring of a desk phone somewhere farther down the hall. He tried a different tone then, softer and managerial. "Let's be practical. I need you to help get Evan in position. A few weeks. Clean handoff. After that, we can revisit title and compensation." I looked at him and understood, with complete calm, that he was still negotiating with the version of me that stayed. "That won't be necessary," I said. "I'll document what must be documented." His fingers tightened slightly on the letter. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means the handoff will follow the agreements in place." I could see the question form in his face before he asked it. "What agreements?" I gave him the smallest polite smile. "The ones legal has." Then I turned and opened the door. Behind me, he said my name once. I did not stop. When I got back to my desk, there was a new message in my inbox. North Axis Legal, received. Will review the transfer language and respond shortly. I read it once, saved a copy, and shut my laptop for the day. Then I waited. The first week of my notice period passed without open conflict. That was almost the most revealing part. No one called a meeting to ask what had happened. No one tried to correct the record. A few people stopped by my desk and said careful things like, "Sorry to hear you're leaving," or "You'll be missed around here." Most of them meant it. None of them had any authority to change the situation. My father-in-law did not speak to me in person again until Thursday. By then, the signs had started showing. North Axis had responded with a formal acknowledgement of my departure notice and a reminder that liaison transfer required written approval and a defined legal sequence. Fulcrum Dynamics sent a shorter note, but the meaning was just as clear. If my direct oversight ended, certain pricing protections and implementation waivers would end with it unless new terms were executed. Those emails were not dramatic, just neat, professional confirmations. The sort of messages that become very loud once finance reads them. I stayed focused on routine. I documented current vendor statuses. I updated the internal implementation map as far as was appropriate. I created a clean list of open items and left clear comments where another team would need to make decisions after my departure. I did not hide anything. I also did not do anyone's thinking for them. That distinction mattered. On Thursday afternoon, my calendar populated with a last-minute invite. Conference Room C. Transition discussion, no agenda. No explanation. Just the time. Conference Room C was smaller than the main boardroom. Frosted glass wall, oval table, stale air that always smelled faintly of dry erase markers and carpet cleaner. I arrived 2 minutes early. My father-in-law was already there, along with Evan and someone from legal named Priya. That told me enough. I took a seat across from them and set my notebook on the table. My father-in-law opened first. "Thanks for joining us," he said, too smooth. "We just want to make sure we're aligned on transition and keep this constructive." Priya gave me a polite nod. Evan looked like he had not slept well in several nights. I folded my hands. My father-in-law slid a printed list across the table. "This is a summary of materials and relationships we'll need transferred before your departure." I looked down. Vendor contacts, contract notes, rollout sequencing, client history, implementation architecture. Several items were described in language broad enough to include half the operational memory of the company. I set the paper back down. "What exactly are you asking for?" I said. He smiled, but only with his mouth. "A complete transfer. We need continuity." Priya spoke then, calm and careful. "We also need clarity on which materials are internal work product and which may be subject to named author or contractual use limitations." That was the first honest sentence in the room. My father-in-law turned slightly toward her, then back to me. "There shouldn't be much confusion there." I looked at him. "There is enough confusion for legal to be here," I said. No one spoke for a second. Then Evan cleared his throat. "I'm really just trying to understand the structure so I can keep the project moving." His voice was not arrogant now. It was strained, younger than it had sounded in the all-hands meeting. I nodded once. "I'm sure you are." He shifted in his chair. I opened my notebook and turned it toward them. "Here is the reality," I said. "There are 3 categories." I wrote them in a short column as I spoke. First, standard company materials. Shared dashboards, approved reports, active status trackers, basic vendor files. Those can be transferred normally. I wrote one. Standard internal materials. Second, contract-bound workflows tied to named oversight or named liaison language. Those cannot be reassigned by assumption. They move when the contracts say they move. I wrote 2. Contract-limited functions. Third, framework materials I authored that were never formally reassigned under the internal approval process. I wrote 3. Unassigned authored framework materials. Then I capped the pen and looked up. That is the structure. My father-in-law exhaled through his nose. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be." "No," I said. "I'm describing the system as it exists." He leaned forward. "You built those systems here. On company time." Priya intervened before I answered. "Respectfully, that's not the full legal test." The room quieted again. That was the moment the conversation stopped being managerial and became factual. My father-in-law looked irritated now, though he tried to keep the irritation dressed as patience. "So what are you saying?" he asked. "That we can't use our own project materials?" I kept my voice even. "I'm saying you should not rely on assumptions where the paperwork says otherwise." Evan looked from him to me to Priya, as if the floor under the room had shifted slightly and only everyone else had felt it sooner. Priya opened a red folder in front of her. "I reviewed some of the contract set this morning," she said. North Axis is clear. Transfer requires 30 days notice and written legal approval. Fulcrum's pricing waiver language is also tied to Melissa's named supervisory role. And there appeared to be internal framework documents that were drafted by her and never formally assigned through board-approved transfer. My father-in-law stared at her. Board-approved. She nodded. That is what the internal policy requires for strategic process architecture at this level. I watched him do the math. Not the emotional math. The operational one. Timelines. Costs. Exposure. Delay. This was how truth usually arrived in business. Not as a speech. As a sequence of constraints no one could charm away. He turned back to me. What do you want? It was not an apology. It was not even a concession. But it was the first direct question he had asked me in years that assumed I might actually define the situation. I answered carefully. I want the transition to follow the actual agreements. Nothing more and nothing less. He held my gaze for a long second. Then he said, and after that? I paused. Then I said, after that, if you need outside support, you can request it through my firm. That was the first time I said the words out loud in that building. My firm. Evan looked down at the table. Priya made a note. My father-in-law sat back slowly, as if the chair had become less stable under him. No one raised their voice. No one argued. There was nothing left to argue with. At the end of the meeting, Priya collected the papers and said she would circulate a formal summary. Evan left first, carrying his laptop against his chest. My father-in-law remained seated for a few seconds after everyone stood. As I reached the door, he said my name. I turned. His expression had changed again. Less offended now. More tired. You really planned all this? I thought about the question. Then I answered truthfully. No, I just kept track of what was real. I left the room and walked back to my desk. At 5:18 that evening, an email arrived from legal with the subject line. Transition restrictions and outstanding rights review. I opened it. Read the first paragraph. Then I saved a copy to a folder on my desktop and closed my laptop. The next stage was no longer personal. It was procedural. Then I went home. My final day came and went without ceremony. There was no farewell lunch. No framed card passed around the office. A few people stopped by with quiet goodbyes, and one of the analysts from procurement left a small box of tea sachets on my desk with a note that said, "For calmer mornings." I thanked her, packed the last of my notebooks, returned my badge, and walked out through the side entrance just after 4. The air outside was cold and clean. I remember hearing traffic from the avenue and the dry sound of leaves moving along the curb. I did not look back. For the first 3 days after I left, nothing happened directly in front of me. That was expected. Companies rarely collapse all at once. They begin by pretending nothing important has changed. Then small things stop moving. The first sign came from a former coworker who texted me a screenshot of an internal message. Does anyone have the updated North Axis chain? Orders are sitting. No answer below it. A few hours later came another. Fulcrum is reissuing pricing. Finance wants to know why. Then, late that evening, a third message. Who owns the elevation implementation map? I read each one once and set the phone down. The next morning, I was at a small co-working office I had rented downtown. Nothing fancy. Clean dusk. Quiet hallway. Tall windows facing a parking garage and a row of bare maple trees. The place smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and the eucalyptus cleaner they used on the counters. I spent that morning organizing my own materials. New client folder. Consulting agreement template. Insurance documents. Bank confirmation for the LLC. Routine things. A little after 11, an email arrived from North Axis Legal. They confirmed that no transfer request had been properly completed before my departure, and that vendor instructions from unauthorized personnel would not be processed until the contractual sequence was satisfied. Again, not dramatic, just exact. That same afternoon, Fulcrum Dynamics sent formal notice to the company that the implementation fee waiver had expired with the end of my named oversight period. Revised pricing would apply immediately. By Friday, the consequences had become visible enough that even people outside operations could see them. A client milestone slipped. A shipment sequence stalled. Finance started recalculating projected margins for the quarter. Legal asked for copies of archived approval chains. And somewhere in the middle of that, Evan apparently led a vendor update call that did more harm than good. I did not hear it live, but I later received a clean summary from someone who had. A client asked who now controlled the architecture behind Phase 2. Evan said the materials were still being centralized. Then someone asked whether the licensing structure had been fully transferred. He answered vaguely. That was enough. When competent people hear uncertainty around ownership, licensing, or authority, they do not hear, "We'll sort it out." They hear risk. By the following Tuesday, my father-in-law called. I let it ring once, then twice. On the third call, I answered. "Melissa," he said, voice carefully neutral. "Do you have a minute?" "I do." There was a short pause. I could hear office noise behind him. Muffled footsteps. A door shutting. The low sound of a printer or a copier somewhere nearby. "We've run into a few transition issues," he said. "I'd like to discuss bringing you in on a temporary basis, just to stabilize things." I looked out at the pale light on the opposite building and said nothing for a moment. Then I asked, in what capacity? As a consultant, he said quickly. Short term. To support continuity. Not to apologize. Not to acknowledge. To support continuity. I turned once in my chair and opened a blank note. "If you'd like a formal engagement," I said, "I can send terms." He gave a small laugh that did not sound comfortable. "Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." "It already is," I said. Silence. Then, more carefully, he asked, "What would your terms be?" I gave them to him in plain language. A monthly retainer. 90-day minimum. Limited scope defined in writing. No direct reporting through Evan. All vendor and client communications routed through approved channels. Prepayment for the first month. He was quiet long enough that I thought the call might end there. Instead, he said, "Send it over." So I did. 2 hours later, the signed agreement came back with wire confirmation attached. That was the first layer. The second came from the clients. Hexbridge Industrial had been one of the company's largest accounts for years. I had managed most of the relationship myself, though my name rarely appeared in the summary slides leadership liked to present upstairs. A week after my consulting retainer began, someone I knew inside the company forwarded me notes from an emergency account meeting. Hexbridge's operations director had joined the call, listened to the update, and then said, very plainly, that they would not continue under the current arrangement unless I was directly re-engaged on their account. Not the team. Not the company. Me. They had already contacted my firm separately to discuss a direct support structure. That sentence moved through the company faster than any speech ever could. Numbers followed. The projected revenue at risk was high enough to get the board involved. That was when the matter stopped being a bruised internal dispute and became what it had always really been, a failure of judgment with measurable cost. I was not in the room for the board review, but I did not need to be. Priya from legal sent me a formal request for clarification on authored framework ownership, implementation maps, and transfer status. Her email was dry, precise, and copied exactly the people it needed to copy. I answered with documents, creation histories, approval records, assignment gaps, contract references, timelines, nothing emotional, no narrative, just dates, files, and signatures. A few days later, I received confirmation that the board had been advised of 3 facts. First, certain vendor functions had been tied by contract to my named role and had not been properly transferred before my departure. Second, pricing protections attached to my supervision had lapsed exactly as the agreements allowed. Third, portions of the elevation framework I authored had never been formally reassigned under the company's own internal policy. That was the truth of it. Not revenge. Not sabotage. Administration. Neglect has a way of turning ordinary paperwork into consequences. Evan resigned not long after. I heard that quietly through the same steady network of people who had always understood more than leadership assumed. No scandal. No scene. He simply stopped coming in. My father-in-law remained, but not in the same way. His authority was no longer automatic. Too many expensive mistakes had gathered around one decision everyone now understood. As for me, the first month of consulting brought in more than the final 3 months of my salary there. Not because I suddenly became smarter after leaving, because the work was finally being priced as work. One Friday afternoon, I received an email from finance at my former company. Subject line, retainer renewal approval. I opened it, reviewed the terms, forwarded it to my assistant, and wrote a 2-line reply. Approved as revised. Please ensure all future requests come through the client portal. Then I sent it and closed the laptop. Outside, the light had already started fading. The room was quiet, and for the first time in years, so was I. A few months later, my life was smaller in the right ways. Not smaller in value, smaller in noise. I woke up earlier than I used to, not because I had to, but because my mornings belonged to me again. I made tea instead of grabbing coffee on the way to a crisis. I opened the blinds in my apartment and let the light come in slowly across the kitchen floor. I watered the plant by the window that I had nearly forgotten existed during those last years of the company. Then I sat down and worked. My assistant handled scheduling. Clients came through the portal. Agreements arrived in writing. If someone wanted strategy, they paid for strategy. If they wanted access, they requested it properly. If they wanted urgency, they explained why. It was remarkable how calm work could feel once everything had a place. The company still appeared in my week from time to time, but only in the ways allowed by contract. A document to review. A clarification request. A limited call with a defined agenda. Nothing wandered into my life uninvited anymore. That was the real change. Boundaries are not loud when they are working. One evening, after I finished revising a vendor transition memo for a client in Chicago, I closed my laptop and cleaned the kitchen. I wiped the counter, rinsed 2 cups, folded a dish towel, and set it over the oven handle. The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the baseboard heat. I remember standing there with my tea and realizing I was no longer replaying old conversations in my head. No imaginary explanations. No better versions of meetings. No late answers to questions that should have been obvious to everyone in the room. Just silence. Useful silence. A few weeks after that, I was organizing paper files into a cabinet in my office when I received an email from a woman I had met years earlier at an industry event. She worked at another family-owned company in St. Louis. Her message was brief and careful. She said she had watched a younger male hire get placed over work she had built herself. She said she was not angry, only tired. She wanted to know how to prepare before making any decisions. I read her message once. Then I put the phone face down and looked out the window for a moment. After that, I replied with 3 suggestions. Keep records. Read every agreement. Do not confuse being quiet with having no position. That was all. People think these situations are rare because most of them never become public. They stay inside meeting rooms, email chains, holiday dinners, and careful introductions. They sit under titles and family names and polished smiles. But the pattern is ordinary. So is the way out. You do not always leave with a speech. Sometimes you leave with copies, dates, and a clean understanding of what belongs to whom. And then you build your life so quietly that the people who ignored your value have to schedule time to reach it. That is what happened to me. Not a dramatic ending, just a clean one. If you stayed with me to the end, thank you. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy calm, real stories like this one. And in the comments, tell me which city you're watching from and what time it is there right now. 2 popular stories will be on your screen next, and I think you'll enjoy both of them.